Welcome to the final section of the constitutional unit. We're going to discuss Thurgood Marshall's speech, The African American Perspective of the Constitution. And this is a very powerful speech and reflects the greatness of the man who wrote it. Thurgood Marshall lived in the South during the 1930s in segregation, went to Howard Law School, where he was an outstanding student, and then later on was the NAACP legal counsel that brought the Brown v. Board of Education cases to the Supreme Court. In his biography and in his discussions, Marshall talked in terms of the standards of his professors and how they viewed the law as not only a shield but a sword, and how the law, if practiced correctly, if developed in skill, you could change the traditions of the Jim Crow South. So we'll start with the speech, and I'll comment and make comments of the speech. But again, this article is a different perspective, or a perspective that is used when we want to defend our system. And you might raise your eyebrows at that, because Thurgood Marshall understood firsthand how discrimination really destroys the American dream, the American ideal. But underlying people like Thurgood Marshall or Frederick Douglass is the idea of hope. Remember, the character of the person writing the Constitution in 1787 isn't that important. What's important is that the Constitution was written. The Constitution was written so that we can look and interpret the Constitution and understand how popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance can be encapsulated and codified into law. Again, this essay is on page 39 in your text, and let us begin. 1987 marks the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution. A commission has been established to coordinate the celebration. The official meetings, essays and contests, and festivities have begun. The planned commemoration will span 3 years, and I'm told 1987 is, quote, dedicated to the memory of the founders and the document they drafted in Philadelphia. We are to recall, quote, the achievement of our founders and the knowledge and experience that inspired them, the nature of the government they established, its origins, its character, and its ends, and the rights and privileges of citizenship, as well as its attendant responsibilities. Like many anniversaries, celebrations, the plans for 1987 take particular events and hold them up as the source of all the very best that has followed. Patriotic feelings will surely swell, prompting proud proclamations of the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice shared by the framers and reflected in a written document now yellowed with age. This is unfortunate. Not the patriotism itself, but the tendency for the celebration to oversimplify and overlook the many other events that have been instrumental in our achievement as a nation. Pardon me. The focus of the celebration invites a complacent belief that the vision of those who debated and compromised in Philadelphia yielded the, quote, more perfect union it is said we now enjoy. I cannot accept this invitation, for I do not believe that the meaning of the Constitution was forever, quote, fixed, unquote, at the Philadelphia Convention. Nor do I find the wisdom, foresight, and the sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government and its respect for individual freedoms and human rights we hold as fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite, quote, the Constitution, end quote, they invoke a concept that is vastly different from what the framers barely begun to construct 2 centuries ago. For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble: we the people. When the Founding Fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of America's citizens. We the people included the words of the framers, quote, the whole number of free persons, end quote. On a matter so basic as the right to vote, for example, Negro slaves were excluded, although they were counted for representational purposes as 3/5 each. Women did not gain the right to vote for over 130 years. These omissions were intentional. The record of the framers' debates on the slave question is especially clear. The Southern states acceded to the demands of the New England states for giving Congress broad powers to regulate commerce in exchange for the right to continue the slave trade. The economic interests of the regions coalesced. New Englanders engaged in, quote, carrying trade, end quote, would profit from the transporting slaves from Africa, as well as goods produced in America by slave labor. The perpetuation of slavery ensured the primary source of wealth to the Southern states. Despite this clear understanding of the role slavery would play in the new republic, use of the words slaves and slavery was carefully avoided in the original document. Political representation in the lower house of Congress was to be based on the population of, quote, free persons, end quote, in each state, plus 3/5 of all other persons. Moral principles against slavery for those who had them were compromised, with no explanation of the conflicting principles for which the American Revolutionary War has ostentatiously been fought. The self-evident truths, quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was not the first such compromise. Even these ringing phrases from the Declaration of Independence are filled with irony, for an early draft of what became the Declaration assailed the King of England for suppressing legislative attempts to end the slave trade and for encouraging slave rebellions. The final draft adopted in 1776 did not contain these criticisms, and so again, at the Constitutional Convention, eloquent objections to the institution of slavery went unheeded, and its opponents eventually consented to a document which laid a foundation for the tragic events that were to follow. Pennsylvania Governor Morris provides an example. He opposed slavery and the counting of slaves in determining the basis for representation in Congress. At the convention, he objected that, quote, the inhabitant of Georgia or South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice, end quote. And yet Governor Morris eventually accepted the 3/5 accommodation. In fact, he wrote the final draft of the Constitution, the very document the bicentennial will commemorate. As a result of the compromise, the right of the Southern states to continue importing slaves was extended. Officially, at least until 1808. We know that it actually lasted a good deal longer, as the framers possessed no monopoly on the ability to trade moral principles for self-interest. But they nevertheless set an unfortunate example. Slaves could be imported if the commercial interests of the North were protected. To make the compromise even more palatable, customs duties would be imposed up to $10 per slave as a means of raising public revenue. No doubt, it will be said, when the unpleasant truth of the history of slavery in America is mentioned during this bicentennial year, that the Constitution was a product of its times and embodied a compromise which, under other circumstances, would not have been made. but the effects of the framers' compromise have remained for generations. They arose from the contradiction between guaranteeing liberty and justice for all and denying both to Negroes. The original intent of the phrase, "we the people," was far too clear for any ameliorating construction. Writing for the Supreme Court in 1857, Chief Justice Taney penned the following passage in the Dred Scott case. On the issue whether, in the eyes of the framers, slaves were constituent members of the sovereignty and were to be included among "we the people," Taney wrote, "We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included." They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Accordingly, a Negro of the African race was regarded as an article of property and held and bought and sold as such. No one seems to have doubted the correctness of this prevailing opinion of the time, end quote. Going back to Thurgood Marshall. And so, nearly 7 decades after the Constitutional Convention, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the prevailing opinion of the framers regarding the rights of Negroes in America. It took a bloody civil war before the 13th Amendment could be adopted to abolish slavery, though not the consequences slavery would have for future Americans. While the Union survived the Civil War, the Constitution did not. This is a very important point. While the Union survived the Civil War, the Constitution did not. What he means by this is this concept of "we the people" that excludes everyone except the framers of the Constitution. This expansion of popular sovereignty, this expansion of the idea that we the people is a universal concept. That Constitution that held people in slavery did not survive the Civil War. Instead, we can look at 1865 and the end of the American Civil War as the rebirth or the beginning of the government that we now enjoy today. In its amendments assuring protection of life, liberty, and property for all persons against deprivations without due process, and guaranteeing equal protection of laws, and yet almost another century would pass before any significant recognition was obtained that the rights of Black Americans to share equally even in such basic opportunities as education, housing, and employment, and to have their votes counted and counted equally. In the meantime, Blacks joined America's military to fight its wars and invested untold hours working in its factories and on its farms, contributing to the development of this country's magnificent wealth and waiting to share in its prosperity. What is striking is the role of legal principles have played throughout America's history in determining the condition of Negroes. They were enslaved by law, emancipated by law, disenfranchised and segregated by law. And finally, they have begun to win equality by law. Along the way, new constitutional principles have emerged to meet the challenges of a changing society. The progress has been dramatic, and it will continue. Let me repeat that, because I think it's very important when people disregard or discount rule of law. American Negroes, American African Americans, as Marshall would say, were enslaved by the law. They were emancipated by the law. They were segregated by the law. And the civil rights movement used the law to start and to continue the progress that has been made. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 could not have envisioned these changes. They could not have imagined, nor would they have accepted, that the document they were drafting would one day be construed by a Supreme Court to which had been appointed a woman and a descendant of an African American slave. We, the people, no longer enslave. But the credit does not belong to the framers. It belongs to those who refuse to acquiesce in outdated notions of liberty, justice, and equality, and who strived to better them. If you remember last time, I talked about the aspirational aspect of the Constitution. I tried to point out that the personal characteristics or the personal morality of the framers of the Constitution is not really that important. Historically interesting, and in some ways, to some, maybe inspirational. What is important is the codification and law of the Constitution, of the ideals. You don't have a civil rights movement that Dr. King based on law. You don't have Thurgood Marshall winning a case of integration of schools if you don't have the Constitution, if you don't have it written down, if you don't have as one of your principles of your nation the sanctity of the rule of law. And so we must be careful when focusing on the events which took place in Philadelphia 2 centuries ago, that we not overlook the momentous events which followed and thereby lose our proper sense of perspective. Otherwise, the odds are that for many Americans, the bicentennial celebration will be little more than a blind pilgrimage to the shrine of the original document, now stored in the vault in the National Archives. If we seek instead a sensitive understanding of the Constitution's inherent defects, and this is what we've been trying to do in our previous videos. We don't skip through the defects. We examine them and we show how these things were there and how they have been at least addressed. And its promising evolution through 200 years of history, the celebration of the, quote, miracle at Philadelphia will, in my view, be a far more meaningful and humbling experience. We will see that the true miracle was not the birth of the Constitution, but its life. A life nurtured through 2 turbulent centuries of our own making, and a life embodying much good fortune that was not. Thus, in this bicentennial year, we may not all participate in the festivities with flag-waving fervor. Some may more quietly commemorate the suffering, the struggle, and sacrifice that has triumphed over much of what was wrong with the original document, and observe the anniversary with hopes not realized and promises not fulfilled. I plan to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution as a living document, including the Bill of Rights and other amendments protecting individual freedoms and human rights. Again, this is what we have been talking about in the previous videos and why rule of law and the Constitution as the supreme articulation of that law is so important. So Thurgood Marshall explains and tries to identify this concept of we the people. And he goes on. And when you look at his life, why would a person who suffered the indignities of segregation in the South in the 1930s and struggled against it in his professional life, when in 1965, then President Johnson calls him up and says, hey, do you want to be on the Supreme Court? Why would he accept it? If the Constitution is just a fig leaf, if the Constitution is just BS, if the Constitution has no real power, that it's all money, or it's all white guys, or it's all whatever. Because he understood. He understood that it is law. It is the way that the Constitution can be interpreted is the way that we can strive for equality under the law. And again, this is what the promise of the Constitution holds. So you have a man who personifies this idea of striving for equality under the law and expanding the vision of what it means to be we the people, popular sovereignty. So this is the true, I would contend, and a beautiful articulation of the American nation. If you accept these three principles, right, popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance, then we have a way to go forward. Then we can strive, and we can, sure, there'll be conditions that prove that things are not equal in the absolute vein, right? When we're talking about equality, are we talking about the equality of outcome? Or are we talking about the equality of opportunity? Again, I would contend Marshall is talking about the latter. Dr. King talked about the latter. Malcolm X talked about the latter. And so when we're later on, when we're talking about civil rights and the civil rights movement, it is the Constitution that is the touchstone. It is the Constitution that makes it possible. Again, a contemporary example is the religious minority in China, the Uyghurs. They have been, 1 million or so people have been put in re-education camps. They have been put under surveillance. What is the avenue that these people can strive to become full participating citizens of that country? There isn't one. And I'm not comparing, and I don't mean to say one is better than the other. My point is that, as Thurgood Marshall understood as a young person, that the solution to the problem of racism, the solution to the problem of segregation, the solution to the problem is not what's inside the character of every individual. It is who maintains the law. It is the principles of legal analysis. It is the principles of judicial independence that are embodied in the Constitution. And so we have, at the end of the road, at the end of our discussion of the literal translation or the literal reading of the Constitution, I include this speech, because this speech reminds us that what happened in Philadelphia was not divinely inspired, was not perfect, was not even, we would say, just, if we had used our modern sensibilities. But what was it? Why is it important? It's important because it was written down. It is important because a political document becomes a legal document. It's important because it gives us the structure of government. It gives us the nuts and bolts of how we make decisions, of how we determine representation, of, in a roundabout way, because it took 200 years to get to the point where we are today, how we define our nation and how we define this concept of we the people. Next time, I'm going to be talking to you about how to brief a legal argument, and we're going to go more into detail of the Supreme Court and judicial review. A person, the second Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall, led this idea of judicial review and gave the foundations, generations later, of Thurgood Marshall using the law in order to ensure that we have the components and the concepts of equality under the law as we believe it today. So I'll see you next time.